Good morning, everyone. That's working, yes. Good morning, everyone. Reconvened hearing 4 of variation 2. Just to recap where we're at in the process, we have now heard from all submitters and experts who have attended on their behalf. And on Monday last week in the afternoon, we heard from Mr. Garbett, who's the counsel for DCC, on some of the legal principles to support the officer's reply. On Tuesday, we heard from the DCC experts and also from Ms. Christmas on the broad concepts associated with variation 2. The panel, we then adjourned. The panel did some site visits on Wednesday afternoon, and we've now reconvened to go through the site-specific response from officers, and in that regard we have 2 tables, Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, which are prepared by Mr. Morrissey, I believe. The first ones relate to a range of sites, and the second one really is just a more detailed discussion on particular sites where there was a lot of evidence and discussion. So we have got those, and I believe they're posted on the website. Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, right of reply. And in those tables we have a summary of the additional DCC evidence that was provided in relation to those sites, a summary of the hearing discussion that was presented by submitters and their experts and legal counsel, the officer's response, a summary of their response and their recommendations in relation to those sites. So the purpose of today's session is to go through that and for the panel to ask any questions to help us understand that. All right, thank you everyone, and there's no one in the public gallery, so we'll proceed. Now, Mr. Morrissey, we've got those tables, and how do you intend to present those? Appendix 1 has some gaps that then relate to Appendix 2. Would you prefer to go through the first table and then the second one in order?
Yeah, I was proposing to go through Appendix 1 in its entirety first, probably just for simplicity, although I can mix and match. And I was just proposing to outline, not go through, read the whole thing out repeatedly, but just go through my key recommendation for each site and then give a chance to ask any questions or clarifications.
Yes, I think that's the way to go. So if you go to your response points and the overall recommendation for each one, that would be useful. Thank you.
Okay, so starting with Appendix 1, I've got the broad submissions. I have just noticed a small correction to that, in that I say in the response that Ms. Christmas discusses the DCC submission 187.017 in her evidence. That's actually discussed in Appendix 2 of my evidence. Okay. So a small correction on that. And otherwise on those ones, there were no submitters spoke at the hearing, so I retain the recommendations in my Section 42A report. Okay, starting with the sites, we've got GF01, which is Part 155 Scroggs Hill Road out in Brighton. The key issue outlined in my Section 42A report was related to transportation issues relating to the bottoming of Scroggs Hill Road and the intersections in that area. DCC Transport has advised that they retain that view, that development in this area cannot be supported without further upgrades, substantial upgrades on that road, and no evidence has been presented to advise that these upgrades are possible or feasible. So given there is no change to the DCC transport view and no export evidence being supplied to address this, I retain my original recommendation to not rezone GF01.
Okay, we'll just ask questions as we go. Thank you. Just in relation to I think it's your 4th bullet point in the response points, you raise a question of scope, is that right? So it was originally notified as large lot zoning, and there was a proposal to rezone it to T&S, which is more intensive, isn't it? So
Township and settlement. Yeah. And so that came from one of the submitters, put a proposal which encompassed both GF01 and the adjacent RS 160, which is, you can actually see it on the map. There's the GF01 is sort of a hole in the middle, and then the surrounding RS 160, and it included, that structure plan included a range of zoning, a mix of large lot and township and settlement. That submitter when they spoke. I understand now that they are primarily focused on GFO1. That was their main site. They still obviously support RS 160, but their focus and evidence related to GFO1.
Thank you. Incidentally, we did go out to these sites on our site visit last trip, so we've been out there. Any questions from the panel? Okay. Thank you. We understand that one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next one is RS 160, which is the surrounding of 155 Scroggs Hill Road. And we could possibly group that in with RS 220, which is the bit below it, connecting with the Brighton Township shown on the map there. So for both of these, I recommend maintaining my Section 42A recommendation, which is not to rezone. This is based on that there was no evidence presented regarding the transportation upgrades that are necessary for this site. Thank you. Moving on, GFO2. This is out in Moskill, the Gladstone Road South. We had one speaker on that one, two speakers. Both my recommendation was to support rezoning, and I maintain that recommendation with no amendments.
We have a question on that one.
Next one is GFO3. This is
sorry, I didn't have us turned on. We do have a question on
sorry.
that one. No, that's clear. Thank you very much.
Good. Next one, GFO3. This is 16 Hare Road and 7K Force Road out in Ocean View. We had Mr. Kurt Bowen presented on this. My recommendation in the Section 42A report was to rezone. We did hear some evidence relating to the flooding hazard, that may have been lower than first outlined. So my recommendation is to continue rezone, it's to support rezoning to township and settlement. GFO4, this is 127A Main Road in Fairfield. It's adjacent to the motorway. We didn't have any speakers on this, but we did have some evidence submitted by Mr. Conrad Anderson. In the Section 42A report, my recommendation was to rezone, but subject to potentially some more discussion with Waka Kotahi regarding the site and reverse sensitivity. My recommendation now is to continue to support rezoning. I do recommend that an NDMA overlay is applied, and I note that this is how it was notified. This is to ensure good stormwater management, ensure that the subdivision supports best practice outcomes and achieves the strategic objectives of the plan and ensures good consistency of approach. In keeping with the other site that was adjacent to the motorway, which we'll come to in a bit, GFO8, I do recommend that a structure plan mapped area is applied to this site, and this requires an acoustic assessment to be undertaken at the time of subdivision, given its proximity to the motorway.
Yes, that's right. We didn't have evidence on this one. So access is to be from the, not from the motorway, obviously. It's from the side road. Okay. And so the potential issue with Waka Kotahi is more to do with acoustic insulation, is that right?
That was my understanding, yes.
Right, okay.
And potential for reverse sensitivity.
Right. But your recommendations are based on it still being a suitable site. It's a matter of just going through the design for housing insulation and the like. Overall,
I consider it suitable, but I would recommend that the acoustic assessment identify perhaps, if necessary, a no-build zone that might be immediately adjacent to the road,
right,
and then perhaps an effects area further back.
Okay.
And so that is the same recommendation as the other site adjacent to the motorway.
Yes, okay, that's fine. Any questions? Yep.
I think it's been answered, but my question was basically, was there any difficulty making this recommendation in the context of the absence of Waka Kotahi evidence?
I mean, in the sense that we don't have a guaranteed idea of their viewpoint, which we don't, but I think it's consistent with our other approach to the site, and I'm confident that at the time of subdivision the effect could be appropriately addressed.
It's just the application of the NDMA. Is that because there's undeveloped land on the right? I mean, would we normally do an NDMA in an area that's fairly bounded by already developed areas?
So this site is actually split in half. The rezoning relates to the half of the site adjacent to the motorway. The upper half is already zoned, and there is already on, I believe, subdivision consent. The NDMA proposal is to cover the whole site. So it's more sites than perhaps it might first be thought. I believe it's 13 in the lower half. I can't remember how many in the top, probably similar. So it's roughly 20 sites. And my approach was to still recommend the NDMA just to ensure that good outcome.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just going back to the NZTA thing, they had an opportunity to participate and make specific submissions, and that's fine. And I think you've also noted that there is an assessment matter. Council consider the effects on the safety and efficiency of the highway. I presume that includes acoustic matters. It doesn't sort of say that, does it? It relates more to the...
I think that is more in relation to transportation and access. I think.
Yes, so I guess for us, we just need to be satisfied that the land can accommodate housing and there wouldn't be a no-build area over the whole site. I'm just wondering if you have looked at the separation distances and you're reasonably satisfied that some houses could be built there, subject to that?
I have seen the indicative, in his evidence, Mr. Anderson does provide an indicative layout plan, and he does note that the houses are set back somewhat at least from the road, so they're not built up hard against that boundary.
All right,
which is
understood.
Which is something.
Yeah.
And I believe as well they would also likely face away from the road, just due to sunlight. They'd likely face north, so they'd have their backs to the roads. There were some mitigating factors in the proposal.
Understood. We'll go back and look at Mr. Anderson's evidence. Thank you very much. No further questions on that?
GFO 5, this is part 353, Main South Road. So the key consideration for this site was hazards, and in my section 42A report, I believe I said do not rezone based on the Stantec hazard assessment of high level hazards. Since then, we've had a geotech assessment from Geosolve, which has been reviewed by Stantec, and I am satisfied that the area of GFO5 is suitable for residential rezoning to GR1 from a hazards perspective, subject to an NDMA and a structure plan, which I would recommend includes a 12-metre buffer from the adjoining mining/industrial land. That was recommended by the submitter themselves. I say here a road connection linking Severn Street with Main South Road. I'll come back to that. And a requirement for a geotechnical assessment at the time of subdivision over the entire area of GFO5. However, regarding the adjacent GFO5A, which isn't shown on the map, but it's in the sort of bottom right, relying on Stantec's advice in relation to the geotechnical assessment, geotechnical issues, I do not recommend that area is rezoned. And I just note that I can jump because it's right at the end. I make a small comment adjustment on my recommendation for this site in Appendix 2 regarding the connecting road. There was some discussion at the hearing last Monday or Tuesday from Mr. Patterson from Stantec regarding the head of the Miller Street landslide, which is at the top near Severn Street, and there may be issues in constructing a road in that area. So I've since discussed this with DCC Transport to get their opinion on if the rezoning could still be supported if there was only one entrance from the bottom, Main South Road. DC Transport have commented that while a second entrance would be ideal, it isn't necessary to be supported from a transportation perspective. So in light of that, I do wish to recommend that structure plan recommendation slightly. I still recommend rezoning, however, rather than provision of a connecting road, I would recommend provision of a pedestrian cycling connection and also an information requirement to investigate possible secondary access points if these are available.
Just one thing we noted, I'm not sure you've responded on it, and that was the potential safety issue for pedestrians crossing the main road to get across to the sports complexes. Could that form part of a structure plan consideration, do you think? You may have commented, but
I thought I had addressed it, but from a quick skim, I can't. However, I do remember actually checking this with DCC Transport, and they did say that would be something to be assessed at the time of subdivision through an ITA. If there were particular concerns, it is something that could be looked at via a structure plan.
Okay, thank you. I've got no questions on the geotech side of it. I understand that. I don't think we have any further questions on that one. Thank you. Thanks.
Next one is GFO 6. This is Weir Street out on Green Island. We've got no submitters speaking at the hearing. My recommendation was to rezone, and I maintain that recommendation now.
Thank you.
Okay, the next two I'm going to group together. This is the Emerson Street sites. We've got GFO 7 and the immediately adjacent RS 169, both on Emerson Street. In the section 40, so there's that one highlighted is 33 Emerson Street, and the other one is immediately below it. In the section 42A report, I was hesitant. In fact, I think I said do not rezone based on concerns about the feasibility of upgrading Emerson Street. DCC Transport has since advised that the evidence provided is sufficient regarding the feasibility of conducting these upgrades. And so based on this, I recommend rezoning both sites and applying a NDMA also over both sites, considering they can effectively be treated as one.
Commissioner O'Malley, you had a number of questions on that one at the hearing. Do you have any further questions on this?
No, I'm relatively happy. I'm pretty happy with the answer. I do. Just the NDMA question. When you do that, because it's stormwater management, do you look at the topography of the whole area and that defines the NDMA site, or
to a degree?
Or is it still only the rezoned area that's looked at?
My understanding is that the NDMA, in this case, would provide an integrated stormwater management approach across both sites, so an opportunity to combine assessment and infrastructure for both of these sites. They're on the same sort of overall gradient sloping down into Emerson Street, and so it made sense to combine them.
I can see that, and looking at the topography map, it's backed up by a ridge, but if there were geographic features that would supply overland water flow that were outside a area, would you apply the NDMA outside that area? So it's only really for the zoned areas. Okay, thanks. It's the general NDMA question rather than the actual decision.
Thank you. No further questions on that one. Thanks.
Okay, next one is GFO 8. This is the other motorway site, so to speak. So we did hear from the speaker, from submitters on this one. My recommendation in the Section 42A report was to support rezoning, subject to discussion at the hearing regarding the potential for reverse sensitivity. As you'll recall, the submitter has provided a preliminary acoustic assessment which identified a no-build zone and the immediately adjacent and the effects area, but they did comment that a more in-depth assessment with some additional criteria would be necessary at the time of subdivision. So based on that, I still recommend rezoning the whole site to GR2, but recommend a structure plan rule is applied requiring a more detailed acoustic assessment take place at the time of subdivision. So that was for things like any mitigation measures that might be implemented or needed, and also double-storey buildings.
That's fine. Yes, we have the acoustic assessment, which takes us a little further down the track than for the other site, but it appears possible to build on that site within constraints from that evidence. Thank you very much. Okay. All right.
Okay, next one is GF09. These are the three, the 41 to 49 3 Mile Hill Road, halfway bush sites. So these are the sites, 5 sites that are already built and developed. The proposal was to rezone these to large lot residential to reflect the current land use, essentially. So we did hear from 2 submitters on this, who both opposed this rezoning. However, as I detail in my table, I don't believe this does set a precedent, and I do recommend that these are rezoned still.
Yep, understood. Is this one slightly different to most of the other requests in that it's sort of a tidy up type change, dealing more with how the houses are if they wish to be altered or extended, they're not constrained by the rural rules, is that?
So in the Section 32 report, that was the primary justification. It would mean that residential rules would apply rather than rural residential rules. And so it wouldn't enable more subdivision, but it would enable better compliance with the residential rules.
And in relation to the precedent issue, understand your advice here, but essentially for precedent to be an issue, if it is an issue in fact, with a plan change matter, there would have to be other sites in the same situation as this for any precedent to be set. Would that be right? Even if it were a valid principle.
Are you saying if there were more sites with this misplaced zoning?
With the same sort of characteristics, undersized and narrow sites that can't be developed any further, would there be other sites in the same category, do you think?
I'm unsure of that, sorry. I think my interpretation of the submitters, they were concerned about any further subdivision potential in the area. And so if there were other undersized sites that needed a zone tidy up, I think this would be the same factor, and that this doesn't enable more subdivision.
All right, no, that's fine. Any further questions on that? No. Very good, thank you.
Okay, GF10, which is Honeystone Street. This is adjacent to the big site of Whakaari, which I'll address in Appendix 2. We didn't have any submitters speak specifically to the site, and I do retain my original recommendation, but I will possibly address it at the time of GF11. I am recommending a small amendment to the structure plan for the site to enable a second entranceway if a connection into GF11 is necessary.
Yeah, we probably will have some questions in relation to 11, so we'll come back to that.
Come back to 11?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, GF12, this is 233 Signal Hill Road, up the Northeast Valley. In the Section 42A report, my recommendation was not to rezone this based on transportation issues, that there's no ability to access the site. We have had some evidence in the hearing regarding this access. However, DCC Transport has continued to advise that they can't support this proposal from a transport perspective. And based on that, I consider that there is a potential issue with accessing the site and maintain that it is not appropriate for rezoning.
I'm just trying to understand that, but I'm just trying to think from the submitter's point of view, is it just about access? In other words, before they go out and do some more work on and potentially raise this again as a potential site, are there other fundamental issues that would count against this being rezoned in the future, do you think? Is it something that would be worth putting on record now?
I'd have to double check my 42A, but I am reasonably certain that it was only transport. I did note that the submitters did talk about possible Three Waters servicing, and as per the Three Waters evidence, the site would need to be self-serviced for wastewater and water supply, but that, given it's going to large lot residential 1, that would be appropriate. So my understanding is that this is almost exclusively transportation related.
Okay, and I guess I'll have some questions that might pop up for several sites, but it basically comes to the next step for submitters who may not succeed through this process, and understand there's the future development strategy, which is a bigger study, which could take some time, I suspect. But in terms of, I think you've mentioned a rural residential plan change. I'm not sure if that's a process or if there's another process in place for rural residential rezonings, or whether that's just people would have to run their own private plan changes. But it comes up in relation to another site we'll come to shortly, I think. But is there any further comment that can be made for the benefit of submitters who may not succeed with larger lot or semi-rural residential type developments through this process?
So currently there's no rural residential plan change scheduled in the future work programme. That's not to say that one may not take place in the future. Once the plan is considered operative, people are able to apply for private plan changes. But I suggested that before that they have a conversation with us about the likelihood of any future plan change. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought it might be useful just to put that on record, but understand the recommendation in relation to the site. Any questions on that? No. Okay.
Thank you. GF14, I'll come to in Appendix 2. Next one is the Portobello sites, which I'm going to consider as one. That's GF 15, 16 and 17. We didn't have any submitters speaking on this. However, during the course of the hearing, the panel did ask some questions, which I've outlined responses to in my table. And I believe you've already read those. So for both of those, I do recommend retaining my original recommendation and rezoning.
Yes, I think it's quite a key point. The third bullet point down in the response points in relation to water quality. Basically, you're just alerting us to existing policies and rules in the 2GP which manage activities that could adversely affect water quality. And those are something that we could take into account with some of these rezoning requests where water quality issues have been raised. Do you think? Yeah.
So they are rules that apply broadly across Dunedin, so they're not site specific or anything.
No, that's right. All right.
Okay, that's the end of the GF sites. There's now 3 RTZ sites, RITS sites, but 2 of them are right next to each other. So that's RITS 1 and RITS 3 in Kaikorai Valley. So I'll combine them as together. So we did hear from a submitter regarding RITS 1 and talked about the potential for a roundabout and the second access point that he was in the process of securing and making good headway there. So I do recommend that RITS 1 is rezoned to GR2, and I have commented that based on DCC transport advice, I believe the issue of the Kaikorai Valley Road Bar Street intersection can be assessed further at the time of subdivision when more details are known. I do, however, recommend a small amendment in that I recommend a structure plan rule is applied to the site to require provision of a secondary access point into Kaikorai Valley Road, given this is a key transport consideration and given the density that is being proposed.
And can you just confirm, was that last point you made supported by Transport, DCC Transport?
Yes,
have they requested it? Okay.
Yes. So Mr. Trevor Watson did actually say when he spoke to you on Tuesday, he did note that the access has been resolved, or the one issue, the primary access is resolved. I did clarify that with him afterwards because the transport evidence up till that point had been would want to see a secondary access point, and he agreed that that would be optimal. And given it seems possible as well, possibly even from 2 directions, I have recommended that it would give good connectivity.
Okay. Any questions on that?
Beg your pardon?
Very clear. Yeah, it's very good. Thank you.
Okay, the next one is RITS 2. This is 87 Selwyn Street up the Northeast Valley. We had one submitter on this who lived uphill on the development and was concerned with possible removal of trees on his property. We didn't have any submitters who were advocating for the actual rezoning, based on primarily the hazards, which I outlined in my Section 42A report, and also secondary transport and access considerations. I retain my original recommendation and recommend that the site is not rezoned.
Yep, no questions from me, panel. No, thank you.
Okay, that's the RITSs. RITS 3 can be considered with RITS 1, as already discussed, so that's that. Moving on now to the Irs Requested Sites. First one is Irs 052. This is part 235 Signal Hill Road. If you recall, we did have one submitter scheduled to speak, but they didn't, and so I retain the recommendation of my Section 42A, which is not to rezone, given there are actually no submitters who are now requesting the rezoning. Okay, Irs 14 is the Abbotsford site. I'm going to come to that in Appendix 2. Irs 109, this is 119 Riccarton Road West. So I make a couple of comments here. The Section 42A report did assess rezoning to GR1. However, large lot residential 2 is now being sought. So while I acknowledge this significantly reduced scale of development, I still consider that rezoning to residential remains inconsistent with the criteria specified in Policy 2621. The site is fully disconnected from existing residentially zoned land, located relatively distant to centres and other community facilities. And additionally, I do not consider rezoning these small, isolated and disconnected sites to large lot zoning and efficient use of the land, given they could potentially support GR1 in the future. And Ms Christmas does discuss this concept further in her evidence. And so overall, I do not consider residential rezoning this site appropriate.
And just to elaborate on Ms Christmas's point she made there in relation to LLR, I think she also made a point about it not being necessary to show that a block is viable from a farming perspective to deem that the zoning is inappropriate. There was another point made in her statement, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was raised by one of the submitters, that was there an expectation that a small rural block should have rural productivity, and that was discussed by Ms Christmas, yes.
Thank you. No further questions on that.
Okay, the next one is Irs 110. This is 23 Stretlaw Place. So I've got quite a number of response points there. I'm not gonna labour them, but I can come back to any of them if you'd like. But my recommendation is unchanged from that outlined in the Section 42A report. This is primarily, or this is based on two factors. One is Three Waters considerations, and secondly is access and the apparent difficulty of accessing the site through the right-of-ways.
Probably just the first question in relation to access. Ms Peters did provide us with some additional information and a legal opinion, I guess. Did you consider that or have regard to that?
So when I had written this, I hadn't seen that. So my understanding was, though, that there still remains the issue that the site has to be accessed through one of those two right-of-ways, probably, but possibly both, and that would still they would still have to be acquired in some way. That was my understanding. So based on that alone, I would consider this
an ownership property acquisition issue that hasn't been resolved at this point here.
That was my understanding.
Your understanding. Okay, we'll consider that. Any other questions from the panel on other aspects on this site? I'll just check if I have any more. No, I've got no further questions on this one, and I think the panel are clear too. Okay, thank you.
Okay, the next one is Irs 151. This is 147 St Leonard's Drive out in West Harbour. This is one that I didn't get evidence on originally, but I have subsequently asked our landscape architect, Mr McKinlay, to provide an assessment of the site, and that was detailed in his evidence, which he spoke to on Tuesday. The site is fully contained within the Flagstaff Mount Cargill SNL, and Mr McKinlay has advised that residential development would detract from the consistently rural characteristics of the surrounding hill slopes, which form part of the SNL. So based both on his evidence and also 2621, and as outlined in the Section 42A report, I consider that residential zoning is inconsistent with an SNL overlay.
And there were some other issues in relation to public transport and connectivity in that as well. Is that right?
The site is disconnected. Yeah. You can see it there. It is the lower part of the slope they are proposing, but it's surrounded on all sides by rural residential or rural land. It's reasonably distant from public transport. There's certainly nothing close, but it is also, I would consider, a reasonably isolated pocket.
Oh, we understand that. Thank you.
Okay, the next one is Chain Hills, which I'm going to do in Appendix 2. So I'm going to move on to Irs 157, which is 90 Blackhead Road in Surrounds. Surrounds, as we've already discussed, is 70 Green Island Bush Road, but discuss that further. But I do retain the recommendation in my Section 42A report. The rezoning pockets of land that are isolated and disconnected from existing residentially zoned land is in conflict with Policy 2621. And I also do not consider that rezoning to large lot residential density is the most efficient long-term use of this land, as per my Section 42A report, and I recommend that Irs 157 is not rezoned.
got no particular questions on this site. Have the panel got any questions? No. Just in relation to the broader sort of concept of LL2, we heard from Ms. Christmas on that. Is it a general sort of principle that if you zone large lot residential, unless you show a structure plan or a concept subdivision plan showing further intensification, in other words, the roading supports potential subdivision down the track, so unless a developer provides that plan, it could easily be the land could be compromised by large lot residential not being able to be intensified later on. Is that
so generally with large lot residential, there has to be some reason for zoning it. That zoning that could be due to hazards or need to protect biodiversity or something along those lines. Miss Christmas details all the possible reasons. So if there was an explicit reason for that large lot zoning, then it's likely that that would be the max level it could go to. If you're zoning large lot now to, work around infrastructure constraints, then my recommendation is that isn't appropriate. But the idea, I think, of some of the submitters is they would want that and then do it in such a way that it would allow further intensification in the future.
Oh, it's just, can we just drag that down a little bit so we can see the Emerson Street stuff as well? And it's my question around the effect of the cemetery, and you've answered it in your summary. When would, given that the cemetery acts as a block, when would this area be considered to be contiguous? Is that you'd have to get development beyond the proposed Emerson Street activity around the back of the cemetery before you would continue?
Or that lower bit.
Or that lower bit. But that's the kind of thing we'll be looking for first before you would say.
My understanding would be I think it should come sort of around it in that way.
Right.
Yes, from either side. Otherwise it is still, the cemetery is a break, but you'd still want to see you could still get a connection.
Yeah. See, my question is really just how to achieve, how do you treat a break like that?
A break, yeah.
Okay, no, that's good, thanks. That's a good answer.
Thank you. Yeah.
The next one is Irs 161. This is 210 Signal Hill Road. We heard from the submitter on this one. So the submitter has changed their proposal slightly. They were originally proposing 8 lots, and they're now proposing 3 lots total. So as I discussed, the submitter is proposing to rezone to large lot residential 2 with a structure plan limiting the total number of lots to 3. Given the rezoning area is 6.3 hectares, so limiting the number of total sites to 3 is significantly below the maximum capacity of the site at large lot residential 2 density and is very similar to rural residential 1 density. As per my discussion for Irs 176, which is below, I do not consider this type of zoning appropriate for this variation and consider it would be more appropriately considered under a future rural residential type plan change. Additionally to this, however, Irs 161 is fully contained within the SNL, and while I acknowledge the limited development proposed and the biodiversity enhancements that the submitter is proposing, it is my view that enabling residential zoning in areas of SNL is inconsistent with Policy 2621, and making an exception for this site could set a precedent. So I recommend that Irs 161 is not rezoned.
Yeah, I do actually. I'm just recalling the evidence of Ms. Christmas actually, and that this one stuck out in terms of that question that applies to a number around natural justice and potentially using the backdoor approach to. Is my memory serving me well there?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So that was part of it, and a sort of plan integrity issue that what you've got is a rural residential development called something else, and it will potentially create problems in the future.
Thank you.
Next one is Irs 165. This is 750 High Cliff Road out on the Otago Peninsula. This was originally assessed for GR1. The submitter spoke and is now seeking large lot residential 2 zoning. So in my section 42A report, I concluded that rezoning this site to residential has multiple conflicts with Policy 2621. Most critically, in my mind, is that the entire site is in an ONL. The conflicts I identify in the Section 42 area discussion largely also apply to the now proposed large lot residential 2 zoning as is currently being sought, and I consider that any form of residential zoning at this location is inappropriate, and I retain my original recommendation to not rezone Irs 165.
Okay, and just in relation to the ONL, if you could just clarify for the benefit of viewers, I guess, the ONL in relation to the SNL, the ONL is at a higher level of assessment?
High level.
High threshold.
Yeah.
Yep.
SNL and
Yes.
then ONL.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I've got no questions on this one, thank you.
Okay. Irs 167 is 50 to 60 Brinston Road. No submitters spoke at the hearing, so I retain my original recommendation to not rezone. And same with the next one,
Yep.
Irs 168 Leith Valley.
Yeah, I think you can bypass anywhere you've
Yep.
said that. We won't have any questions of those. Yep, thank you.
Okay, the next 2 as well, the Soyuz Bay Sites. I'm going to talk about them in Appendix 2, so I'll come to those briefly a bit. Moving to the Outram sites, the adjacent Irs 175 and Irs 154 provided quite a number of response points there, talking about capacity, transport, 3 waters, public transport, a few other bits and pieces. I'm not going to labour those unless I need to come back to, but if I can go to my recommendation, I maintain my recommendation to not rezone either site. And I highlight in particular concerns related to stormwater management, the flood to hazard overlay and previous flooding issues with Outram as detailed by some of the submitters, the lack of evidence of need for additional residential capacity to maintain a resilient township as discussed by Ms Christmas, and the distance from the larger centres of Mosgiel and Dunedin leading to increased carbon emissions from commuting. And I also do note that Ms Christmas discussed the compact city and resilient townships objectives further in relation to the site and her evidence.
Yeah, I guess I'll just note that the panel did go and look at these sites in our last visit, and we do acknowledge there's a large amount of evidence being provided on this from the submitter and from council's experts in response, which we'll have to work through. And I guess all I would say is you've accurately summarised all that in here, so we'll need to consider those. I don't think we'll have any particular questions of those, we'll just need to consider them in detail, so thank you very much.
Understood.
Okay.
Okay, the next one is, possibly should have put these in a better order, but Irs 176, this is the Leith Valley site. This is very similar to the Irs 161 Signal Hill site that we've just discussed. The submitter is again proposing large lot residential 2 with 3 lots proposed. This will result in sites of between 4 and 7 approximately hectares each. And I note that this is more consistent with rural residential 1 zoning than large lot residential 2. So Mr Bowen does address this, and he states that the bottom line is that this proposed rezoning seeks a residential zone format and that it will produce additional housing capacity. On this basis, while we accept that the appearance of the rezoning might be more akin to the type of properties that are found in the rural residential zones, the proposed rezoning is entirely compatible with the purpose of variation 2. So I reiterate my view that this type of zoning is not appropriate for this variation, even though I do acknowledge it is technically possible, and I feel it is better considered under a rural residential plan change. And as just discussed before, I do also consider that such an outcome is unfair to other landowners who may also have wanted a rural residential density development, but did not submit as this was not within scope of variation 2. And so my recommendation is consistent with my recommendation on Irs 161 to not rezone.
That last point is more the natural justice issue that was raised by Commissioner Walker just before, isn't
Correct, yes.
So this is a case where the developers are offering what might be significant benefits.
They are.
But it's your comments relate more to the fundamentals of the proposal and when assessed against this particular variation, don't they? Is that right?
That is correct, yes. And I do acknowledge that for all of these, the biodiversity offsets that the submitters are proposing are quite significant and would be a benefit, but I still maintain that this is not an appropriate option for this plan change.
And just a side point, I guess, if this was promoted as a resource consent, would it be considered as a non-complying activity? I imagine it would.
Rural residential 2, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Next one's Tomahawk. I'll talk about that in Appendix 2. So I'm going to jump now to both the Allenton sites. They can be considered, not together, but the same points do apply to quite a lot of both. So there's a number of response points in there, discussing hazards, carbon emission analysis, 3 waters, and some of the centre issues that were brought up by the submitters. Again, I won't labour those because you'll have some reading to do later. But my recommendation is to not rezone the site, and this applies to both sites for several reasons. The site is distant from public transport, centres and facilities, and there is a lack of evidence in relation to what is required to achieve a resilient township. There are potential issues in relation to wastewater servicing, concerns about the ability to manage stormwater, and the site, one of the sites, is partly located on a flood 1A hazard overlay. Where houses are not proposed in these areas, this may affect accessibility during times of flooding. The need for additional development capacity in Allenton should most appropriately be considered through the future development strategy process, which is currently underway. If so, the most appropriate location and overall design, particularly in relation to the adjacent State Highway 1, should be assessed. Consultation with Waka Kotahi at an early stage will be critical for the access sites. And overall, I do not recommend rezoning either RS 195 or RS 200. And I'm sorry, I've seen a couple of typos in here. You've probably picked them up. Appropriate at this time.
Right. Thank you. There's a number of issues there. The panel did go out and view these sites as well. I think we understand the reasons you've given in here, so there's probably not a need to go through those in detail, but one other consideration is that if we were to grant both of them, I'm not sure that we've got any assessment of the cumulative effects of granting both of them. So they've been presented evidence-wise in isolation, but the effect of granting both of them would potentially expand this centre by a significant amount of dwellings, would it not? And also, one development is on the opposite side of the state highway to the other. So those are sort of wider issues which I don't believe we've got evidence on considering both of them together. You've recommended they both be declined, so that sort of clears that one. But one option on the table would be to grant them both, but I'm just not sure we have enough evidence. I wonder if you have any comment on that.
I mean, you are correct. They have been assessed in isolation. They are on opposite sides of the road as well. I guess, relatively speaking, the one we're sort of looking at on the south of Allenton is significantly larger than the one above. The one above is a strip of land. It's a mix of township and settlement and some large lot. So the effects of the bigger site are probably the most critical.
No, we understand the point you're making here. Thank you very much.
Okay, next one is Northeast Valley site, RS206. I'll come to that in my next one. Sorry, I've skipped one. Sorry, wrong page. RS205, Part 761 Aramoana Road. So I have a couple of little response points there, just in relation to some of the issues that came up. But my recommendation, from a planning perspective, I do maintain that rezoning is not very well aligned with Policy 2621 due to a number of issues: coastal hazard risk, sea level rise. I thought there was some evidence provided for those, distance services and public transport, and issues with the compact and accessible city objective. On the other hand, I acknowledge the rezoning is small, surrounded by existing residential zoning on a similar scale. The expert evidence is generally supportive, and from a natural justice perspective, I'm very sympathetic to the submitter's proposal. I note that many, though not all, of the further submitters are supportive of the rezoning as proposed, which is lots 1, 2, 3, because the submitter is no longer proposing the big lot 4 be rezoned, so it's just those 3 sites. And so my overall recommendation is I am not making a recommendation here. I do maintain it's not well aligned with 2621, but I am sympathetic from the natural justice issue. If the panel does choose to rezone the site, I make some suggested amendments in the next column.
Just for clarification, in relation to no further submitters who are, hold on, let me get this right. Many, although not all of the further submitters are supportive of the zoning of lots 1, 2 and 3. Could it be said that the submitter who's opposed to it anticipated that the land behind Lot 4 would be developed? So are we sure that there are submitters opposed to the rezoning of the small lots at the bottom? Are we sure about that?
So my understanding is that Miss Claire Carey, who was, I think, one of the first ones that spoke in relation to that site, I think she was pretty adamantly opposed to any rezoning in that area. Right. That was my interpretation of it, based on the nearby ecological area. So I don't think we could say all support, but I do note that a lot noted that they were only opposed to that Lot 4 development.
Yeah. Understood. Okay.
It's just a significant, it's an SNL question. This recommendation, if we were to go ahead with the rezoning, also recommends the SNL be moved slightly. And I've noticed you've made that recommendation in a few other sites as well. So that primarily is to make sure that we're keeping the SNL clearly defined as to what it is. So if there's minor boundary movements, it's more a case of making sure we're establishing that the SNLs are easily and well defined and consistent, right?
Yeah, that's correct. We also had evidence from Mr. McKinlay that the values of the bottom part of the site were not strongly within the SNL. So when the SNLs were applied, they were applied fairly broadly scale. They weren't assessed site by site. So he's had a closer look at this site, and he's comfortable that the values that are relevant to the SNL are actually those of the hill behind it, rather than the flat.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Okay, the next one, is the North East Valley one, which I'll come to in Appendix 2. The last one for this appendix is the other Riccarton Road West site, Irs 212. So this is very similar to as I've already outlined. I maintain my original recommendation to not rezone Irs 212. The site is disconnected from existing residentially zoned land, and rezoning isolated and disconnected pockets of land conflicts with Policy 2621. If servicing is expected at a general residential or low density residential density, this will result in the need to extend servicing infrastructure and conflict with Policy 2621D Roman 4. I also note that the initial Three Waters comments for this site, which identify significant Three Water servicing issues at low density residential or GR1 density, particularly in relation to wastewater and water supply. And lastly, I do not consider, as we've already been through, I do not consider rezoning these small, isolated and disconnected sites to the large lot residential zoning an efficient use of the land, given they could potentially support GR1 zoning in the future. And I think for this site, that was something explicitly brought up by the submitter as something they would be interested in.
No, I had some questions that have been answered about the applicability of LL sites, so I won't ask it again, so thank you. No further questions on that one. Right, so is that the Appendix 1?
That's Appendix 1.
I just wonder, we might take a short break now. I know we've only been going for an hour, but we'll just recharge the batteries and come back in 10 minutes, okay? We'll take an adjournment. Thank you. Thank you. Reconvene the hearing. It was a useful break to have just to look ahead at what's coming up as well. But also in that time we had handed to us some additional material lodged by Ms Peters, only this morning I believe, in relation to RS 160, Scroggs Hill, and 154, which is the Outram sites. We've had a look through that, and it is relating to information we asked for. It has come through quite late, but we're happy to have a look at that and consider it in our deliberations. And the officers will not have seen this, or at least had no time to fully assess it. But if they wish, they can respond at the end of the day. But otherwise, we will take it as part of our evidence to be considered in deliberations. But you're welcome to make any comments you wish. Okay. All right. We'll move on now to Appendix 2, and we start with GF11, which is the Wockery Road, Helensburgh sites. Yeah, thank you, thank you, P. Mr. Morrissey.
Okay, cool. Can I just check, this was pre-circulated yesterday, have you have had a chance to at least first read?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes, we have.
Okay, so my plan was then, I won't go through every response point, but I would like to highlight, particularly for this first one or two. So if I can start regarding GF11, which is the Wockery site, regarding bullet point 2 on that first page, and this is regarding the purpose of the original Irs recommendation, which I've since changed my recommendation on. So if I can just read this to you. The purpose of the original Irs recommendation was to ensure that necessary infrastructure upgrades were identified, planned, particularly on-site upgrades that will affect multiple landowners, and cost-sharing arrangements agreed. Since the S42A report was published, there's been further discussions regarding these matters. And I also acknowledge the submitter's concerns about the ability to develop if this is predicated on agreement between all landowners on various matters. I now note that an ITA has been progressed by the DCC, which identifies wider network upgrades and the preferred location of roading connections. Off-site roading upgrades will be undertaken by DCC, with the cost recovered through development contributions. This is a pragmatic approach, recognising that there are a number of individual landowners and that some upgrades will also have wider public benefit. Structure plan mapped area rules can identify the need for specific internal roading connections, e.g. a connecting road through the area and the approximate location of connections onto Wockery Road itself. D, a requirement for a recreational reserve can be included in a structure plan rule. The location can be determined at the time of subdivision. I will elaborate on that point slightly further. Stormwater management can be achieved through the NDMA provision. So as a consequence of this work, I am no longer recommending a Irs is applied to the site. So if I can go down to my recommendation. So as noted above, I no longer consider it necessary to apply a Irs to the site. I also recommend 2 NDMAs are applied over the area, reflecting the hydrological catchments as advised by 3 waters. I do not consider an NDMA over 296 Wockery Road necessary, given its small size and very limited development potential or intensification potential. I also continue to recommend structure mapped area rules are applied. However, given the specific rules recommended, my recommendation is that the structure plan, or PAN, need only apply to the sites north of Wockery Road. I note Mr McKinley's recommendation in relation to requiring larger lots of around 1,000 metres squared and street trees rather than the originally recommended large lot residential zoning of the more elevated areas of 195 and 245 Wockery Road. I continue to recommend, however, large lot residential zoning on the property immediately adjacent to Ross Creek, as this was Mr McKinley's original recommendation in the Section 42A report. So I'm recommending that Mr McKinley's advice be implemented via structure plan rules for GF11. So overall, trying to sum this all up, I am recommending rezoning of GF11 as outlined below. Rezone the majority of GF11 and the 2 extensions. That shouldn't be, so that should be GF11A, not GF05A. to general residential 1. The one exception to this is that I recommend the GF11 land that lies within 311 Wockery Road is rezoned to large lot residential. That's the site adjacent to Ross Creek on the top right there. I recommend applying 2 separate NDMAs. One NDMA to cover 312 Wockery Road only, so that is the bottom right, yep, up there. Only, and the other to cover the remainder of GF11, with the single exception of 296 Wockery Road, which does not require an NDMA. That's that small, sorry, can I miss? That's that site, you can see that outline there, it's a very small site. That is the one that Three Waters has advised an NDMA is not required, given its small size. However, that other big site on the south of it, that surrounds it, this site here, they have advised that it is hydrologically connected to the upstream, basically the other side of Wockery Road. There's a couple of roading culverts and everything. So they do recommend that be included in that larger NDMA.
Yeah. Just while we've got the maps there, we're looking at them, can you just show us where the Ross Creek property that you continue to recommend LLR, just show us where that one is?
Yep. Yep, so the very end. So, point 3 there on my recommendations, remove the high-class soils mapped area from the rezoned area. I also recommend amending the boundary of the Flagstaff Mark Cowgill SNL slightly to exclude GF11A in the northern area of 195 Wockery Road. And I recommend applying a structure plan mapped area to the rezoning area on the north side of Wockery Road only. The structure plan should have rules to manage the following: minimum site size and density of 1,000 metre squared lots in the more elevated areas of 195 and 245 Wockery Road. It's the area I originally recommended large lot zoning. An indicative internal roading layout showing a connection across the area with 3 accesses to Wockery Road at indicative locations. A small change to point 3, I've set here a requirement for a 5,000 metre recreation reserve. I wish to change that to an assessment requirement to look at the best location for a 5,000 metre squared reserve, and an information requirement for an amenity tree planting plan at the time of subdivision.
I'll start, there'll be some questions, I'm sure. Just in relation to that last point on the 5,000 metre recreation reserve, that was indicatively shown on the block of land in the middle, I guess, on the, is it Mr Hasty's property, where he was not supportive of the rezoning, is that right? That's where I've seen a map of... well, okay, I'll change my question to a more generic one. You say if at the time of subdivision it could be assessed. Subdivision might be progress in different stages for different blocks, mightn't it?
What we would recommend is that the first application for subdivision in the area be required to show a concept site plan
On their own land?
on the entirety of GF11,
On the
entirety of the structure plan area, and all and so that would ensure linkages between the different sites. So it would, you know, and any further subdivision applications would have to be consistent with that overall site plan.
I'm just trying to understand how that would work, so that if the first developer gets underway, if this is rezoned, of course, they would potentially show it on an adjoining block of land, not their own. Would that be right? That would be a natural thing to do, wouldn't it? How would we get around that difficulty of pushing it off onto the next landowner?
This is probably one of the most difficult aspects with this site, that it is multi-owner, and that we can't, we don't have the information, or there hasn't been the work done to say where the best location for this is and get the agreement of the owners to do that. So what we're proposing is that, and you're quite right, we don't know who's going to apply for subdivision first. It might be a very small site off to one corner that's an inappropriate location for a reserve. But there needs to be some kind of expectation that as the subdivision applications come in, there's some consideration of where the best location is for that. And that's something that's going to have to be dealt with at the time of subdivision. And it might be that the first large site that comes through subdivision, if there's no good reason not to have the reserve within that site, that's where it ends up. So it is tricky. It's not ideal, And that was one of the reasons why we originally proposed the writ, so that we could talk to the landowners, try and get agreement. However, we acknowledge that not all the landowners are agreeable to rezoning this area anyway, and it didn't seem reasonable to withhold development on the whole of the site for everybody just for that one issue. So we're really forced to try and deal with it at the time of subdivision and get the best result that we can. The NDMA provisions that apply to this area do require consideration of provision of reserves. So in a not ideal situation, it's possible we might end up with a number of smaller reserves as people put subdivision applications in. That's not optimal, but it might be where we end up.
So, I mean, it might be in the interest of the first larger development, if you like, to secure a future recreation reserve in conjunction with adjoining landowners as best they can. If they can't, they would need to satisfy council they can do something on their own site.
That is likely to be how it works out, I expect. Yeah.
Yep. Understood. Right, I'll hand over to any other questions. First of all, Commissioner O'Malley.
No, it's just following up on that.
Sorry.
My reading was that this looked like a recreational reserve for playing fields and other such things. I'm not sure if I read that correctly or not. Would an NDMA be able to deal with someone like Parks and Recreation identifying the ideal spot in the same way that if you're dealing with stormwater, you'd be looking at water overflow, so therefore the retention areas would have to be built wherever they have to be built? Could you take that same approach where Parks and Rec would actually say this is the appropriate place, and potentially could something like development contributions deal with it instead?
Yes, I suspect that's how it will happen at the time of subdivision, is that as the issue comes up, Parks will advise whether the site that's being subdivided is the best location or not for the reserve, or where that might be. In terms of how it's developed and who that's paid for, it does make sense that the land is ultimately developed, once identified, is ultimately developed by DCC, and the cost of that recouped through development contributions. But that's, again, something that will have to be worked out at the time of subdivision.
If it can't get worked out between the subdivisions, then
the risk is that you won't end up with a large area.
Yeah.
Yes, that is a risk. We accept that. Yeah.
Thanks.
It's really trading that off against whether we try and hold the site back while those conversations and agreements are put in place, knowing that there's not necessarily any certainty that we would be able to do that within a reasonable time. And in the meantime, development will be held up across the entire site. We're aware that there's a number of people here already keen to subdivide. So that's the balance that needs to be struck. Yeah.
Could you, I'm just thinking of ideas at this point, could you, if you said that there had to be a 5,000 square metre reserve put aside in an area that wasn't planned on being developed at the moment, could the developers who are developing the area put aside sections that could be sold to effectively buy that land later, or things like that? How do we, I guess how can we, the RTZ was I think being suggested as a tool to make sure that that reserve would go in the right place. Can the NDMA tools be used in a way to also make sure that that reserve goes in the right place?
All the NDMA will do is require that it's considered at the time of subdivision that appropriate recreation and reserve spaces are provided for through the subdivision process. But it can only apply, obviously, to the site that's being subdivided.
Yeah, only to that subdivision per se, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I would anticipate, if a small site, there is, I believe, they're outside the area because they're in the existing writs, but a small site in here being subdivided, I doubt that there would be any requirement, obviously, in a small site. But, for example, if 195 came up, that conversation could be had in terms of subdivision on that site about what was appropriate.
Yeah, because this really is about whether we sit with an RTZ or an NDMA, I think, in some respects, in terms of any way of guaranteeing a contiguous 5,000 square metre site. I guess you've sort of given me the answer, which is we wouldn't be able to know till we went to subdivision.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking, Mr. Chair, it's something for us to consider, that how do we protect the formation of that site? Yep.
Yeah. My questions have largely been answered, and I'm actually feeling a bit more solace in the fact that there seems to be a bit of perplexed thinking amongst all of us. I'm just recalling this map, and I think that I had the same idea as the chair that this would be a logical area, but there wasn't a willingness for this to be, if we were ever mind to subdivide it. So my understanding, Mr. Morrison, from the suggestion that, or Miss Christmas, that I think these people potentially, if we were reminded to subdivide, are keen to go, would there be an option within a structure plan to have a contingent amount of land up to 5,000 square in a revised structure plan, but just in this area, not depending on that?
That's certainly something that you could consider to do the decision. Yeah,
Okay.
I do note as well. My recollection is that the reserve strip that backs the houses, the developer had intended to keep that vacant as well for recreational type space. So that might add into the mix as well.
Just a couple of questions of clarification. Just in relation to Three Waters, it seems that there's no problems or issues with number 195, is that right? Because there's no specific mention of it, and it's not proposed to be NDMA.
So in my second to last bullet point I do discuss the possibility of a separate NDMA over 195 Walkery Road only. And I advise that Three Waters is not supportive of that approach, as it would lead to more piecemeal, site-by-site approaches to stormwater management.
So stormwater would be managed just in the normal way in terms of the rules in the plan?
Through the NDMA, correct.
Okay. And the only other question I had was the the third last round bullet point, or unfilled bullet point. I'm just wondering, I thought I understood the traffic evidence to be that if access can't be secured off Walkery Road, then there needed to be a link to GF10, and would that need to go into those bullet points as well?
So the link, you're correct. If access could not be secured through 195 Walkery Road, then a secondary connection into Honeystone Street would become probably necessary. That would need to be in the structure plan for GF10, and so I addressed that in my almost at the back, because currently the structure plan for GF10 is to protect vegetation, and so it enables vegetation. There's a creek sort of around GF10, and the current proposed structure plan is to allow one crossing point to access the north part of it. So my recommendation would be that this could be amended to enable a secondary crossing point into 195 Walkery.
But it would also need to go in the structure plan for GF11, wouldn't it?
It would need to have words along the lines of, these connection points, or something similarly appropriate that provides the same level of connectivity. Yes.
That would guide a subdivision concept plan, would need to show that it's not a lot there that would prevent that from happening.
That there is a possible secondary option, yes. Yeah.
All right. Just have a final look through that. I don't think I've got any further questions on that, but we'll need to go through all of this information in detail. But thank you. I think I understand the report on that matter. Yep. All right, we'll move on.
Next one is GF14. This is 336A Portobello Road out in the Cove. So if you recall, this is one of the early sites that was discussed, and the key consideration was access, Wells Street, and there was also some secondary water supply issues, particularly raised by some of the submitters. So subsequent to this, DCC have discussed this directly with the submitters engineer, and now consider that, as you heard on last week, that subject to final detailed design at the time of subdivision, the proposed access arrangements are achievable, but that the upgrade of Weller Street should form part of a structure plan for the site. And also, as I note in my quite a few response points, I do recommend that an NDMA should be applied to the site to enable appropriate assessment of stormwater management. Three Waters has continued to advise that they would want to see an NDMA, as they have concerns about what is currently being proposed for stormwater management. However, their view is that appropriate management is achievable, but it should be an NDMA overlay to ensure that those requirements are met. They also note that providing compliant water supplies to the 9 existing properties, as is proposed by the submitter, should also form part of the structure plan for the site. I do note that Three Waters have commented that there are a further 10 properties in that area that do or may have extraordinary non-compliant water supply connections that could benefit from further investigation to see if these can also be upgraded. However, I do not consider that the zoning should depend on providing these additional connections. It may be a matter that can be addressed at the time of subdivision, but I wouldn't recommend it as part of a structure plan. So overall, I do recommend that GF14 be rezoned residential, as the key issue of transportation is now able to be addressed. However, I still maintain that sites should be subject to an NDMA to ensure good stormwater management and structure plan mapped area rules to manage the upgrading of Weller Street and provision of DCC compliant water supply to the 9 properties.
See if the panel have any questions first of all. Anyone have a question on that?
Just the water connection. So you're saying not in terms of changing the zoning, but it would be required at the time of consent.
At the time of subdivision,
The
upgrading of those 9 non-compliance would need to happen at the time of subdivision.
And there were some submissions on the proximity of the existing road and retaining walls to property boundaries, and I see you touch on that in your reply. Do you feel that we've also replied sufficiently to observations by some of the residents on the lower hill that there were some minor slips on their properties in major rain events in terms of the geotech stability of the area?
So I guess the submitter did provide a geotech assessment, and that has been reviewed by Stantec, who are in agreements with it, and also Stantec did also do the initial assessment. So that's now a couple of geotechnical assessments that have indicated that development is feasible. Everyone is, there is no doubt that engineering mitigations would be required, but it appears achievable.
Really just for the clarification of today's meeting. So I feel that the last round of questions that we got was that those small slips that were identified by residents were uniquely associated with that small area. In other words, they weren't reflecting of a larger instability. That's correct, isn't it?
Yep. Yes. No, that is my understanding, that there's no wider scale underlying instability of the area.
Yep, good, thanks.
One of the matters that came up with submitters was the wish to be involved in consent applications as affected parties, and I notice you've addressed that under the third bullet point. If an NDMA overlay was applied, any owners of land within the catchment, within the area affected by the NDMA would be naturally or automatically required to give written approval. So is that a positive outcome of an NDMA from their point of view, do you think?
However, that is only for the NDMA land which is under single ownership. So it's actually less relevant here. So the ORC would be an affected party, but not, my understanding, the landowners, the adjacent landowners.
In relation to stormwater management, and one of the issues was discharges into the harbour. Would that be considered as part of the NDMA assessment criteria and any consents required from ORC, I presume?
Yeah, if they're discharging into the harbour, I assume they'd need ORC consent, but all the stormwater, Three Waters have expressed that while they're not happy with the current proposal, they do believe it can be achieved. However, it would need to be through the NDMA overlay.
Thank you. And I think the only other question I had was about Weller Street. You've confirmed it's legal road from the intersection up to the boundary of 335. Is there any authority required from council, I guess? If it's legal road, it would be owned by council, wouldn't it, or administered by council? That would require some sort of approval process, would that be right? I'm just wondering if that's something we should be concerned about, or whether it would be an automatic process.
Yeah, so upgrades to DCC roads would involve the DCC Transportation Department in those conversations. But the feedback that we've had from DCC Transport is that there's no concerns about the approval.
That's right, they've been party to this
Yep.
and make comments, okay. Only other issue I can recall that came up was the private accesses to properties that the owners felt they would be compromised by the improvement at the intersection. I understand all the improvements will be on the road reserve, not on private property. That's what I took from this. Is that correct?
DCC Transport has advised that there would be no encroachment on private property. They do note that some access could be required to actually conduct the upgrades onto private property. However, they say that could be left to the actual further details at the time of subdivision.
Okay, and just finally to recap, so the key comments from experts are the DCC Transport. There are no longer any overriding transport objections to the proposal. Stantec, overall the site is suitable for rezoning, and Three Waters recommend an NDMA be applied, but things can be managed under that. So overall the recommendation is to grant this one.
Correct.
Rezone it. Yep. Okay. Got no further questions. Thank you.
Okay, the next one is RS14. This is Abbotsford. It's the big one. So if I can just go straight to my recommendation, because I touch on the response points in that. So I firstly note the significant amount of evidence provided by the submitters in respect to the site. I also note that there was some of the submitters overlapped with others in terms of their evidence. Others were more discreet. 42A, that's the one at the side, was a discreet sort of proposal. The other three were a bit more intertwined. And I would comment here that the original assessment in the Section 42A report was based on RS14 as a whole, rather than on the 4 individual sites that constitute RS14. So Stantec has considered that rezoning is acceptable from a hazards perspective, with the exception of 42A Lambert Street, which on this map is the one the disconnected one on the left. So as a consequence of that, I do consider that rezoning 42A Lambert Street standalone to be inappropriate. But in relation to the hazards on the other sites, these appear to be resolvable. DCC Transport have remaining concerns about the proposed Abbots Hill Road extension and upgrade, and also the impacts on North Tyree Road. Increased traffic on North Tyree Road and the downstream effects of the network, such related junctions, have not been adequately addressed, and the concerns were outlined in their initial comments for this site.
And just to confirm on that one, I think I asked Mr. Watson a question, and his comments relate to both parcels of land, even if treated separately.
Correct.
Yeah, is that right?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
That it relates to both the whole and part. Obviously, the whole is more effect. Three Waters has also reviewed the submitter's evidence and has advised that rezoning is not supported due to issues with all Three Waters. Three Waters also do not support rezoning of smaller sub-areas of the site as proposed by some submitters, including 42A Lambert Street and 25 and 55 McMeekin Road. Three Waters have commented that they do not agree that the issues could be dealt with at the time of subdivision, and has commented that our written evidence indicates a number of upgrades that would be required should the site be rezoned. The timing for some of the upgrades is medium to long term and would likely be different to the developer's time frame if the site were to be rezoned. So overall, based primarily on the transport and Three Waters evidence received, as well as the hazards in relation to 42A Lambert, I do not recommend rezoning RS14. This recommendation applies to both the site as a whole and also the individual sites that together constitute RS14. Based on the expert evidence received, I do not consider any part of RS14 as appropriate for residential zoning at this time. Now the next 3 paragraphs, if I can summarise them very briefly, there was also a proposal for a RITS over part of 188 North Tyree Road. This would have a site-specific release rule governing the release of land that would be subject to a geotech investigation and funding of the necessary upgrades. And I just want to re-emphasise the concerns already identified by DCC Transport and Three Waters for the overall area, that no solutions have been proposed by the submitter in relation to North Tyree Road or the feasibility of achieving these. Three Waters' concerns also remain, and so overall I'm not supportive of this proposal either. And I note that this is a complicated site. There is a lot of evidence. There is a lot of DCC evidence in response to that evidence. So there is a bit to work through on that one. But that is my condensed summary.
Thank you. Any questions? I understand the point you're making. We'll need to consider those in conjunction with the evidence. So thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next one is Chain Hills. This is the adjacent RS 153 and RS 204. Again, I've got a couple of little response points there just in relation to some of the issues came up at the hearing. I'm not going to labour those. If I go to my recommendation, and maintain the recommendation in my section 42A report to not rezone either site. The primary reason for this is based on the three waters evidence, which outlines significant issues with all three waters. So Mr. Jared Oliver spoke to you last week and outlined this in quite some detail, and overall three waters do not support rezoning the site, either as a whole or in part, and has expressed significant concerns about servicing for all three waters. And I've outlined below the drinking water, wastewater and stormwater concerns in very condensed detail. I also note Mr. McKinley's landscape recommendation, which is if rezoning were to proceed, it should be limited to the lower slopes below approximately the 90-metre contour, and the submitter's landscape architect was broadly in agreement with that. I think there was maybe a 10-20 metre variation, but the gist of it was similar. So therefore, while acknowledging that the submitter's evidence does address some of the concerns that were outlined in the Section 42A report, such as transportation, who can now support the proposal, I am of the view that rezoning is not appropriate for any part of the site, based in particular on the concerns outlined by three waters and that were discussed last week. I therefore recommend that neither site is rezoned to residential as requested.
Absolutely, not even the lower slopes area.
Based on the three waters evidence, which was unsupportive of literally the whole thing, correct.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. We'll need to go back and look at the evidence again, obviously, in particular the three waters evidence on whether on their reasons for the whole land not being rezoned. So we will look very closely at that. But do understand your summary of the issues, so thank you very much. No further questions on that. Just to acknowledge the policy 6B matters which we've been through with Mr. Garbutt. We'll need to consider that as well in relation to the upper slopes and landscape effects, visual effects. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, the next two are the two Soyuz Bay sites. I'll discuss them individually. The reason they're here is the 3 Brick Hill Road and 18 Noya one. When I wrote this, we were waiting for the Port Otago response. So so I needed to wait for that. And then just to ensure that we were treating the sites consistently, I also held back on a recommendation for the RS 171. Hence, they're both in this Appendix 2. But if I can start with RS 170, which is 103, 105, 107 Hall Road, top end of Soyuz Bay. So in my Section 42A report, I concluded that the rezoning of RS 170 is generally consistent with the criteria in Policy 2621. The exception to this was issues relating to 3 water servicing, in particular wastewater and potable and water supply, and the upgrades needed to resolve those issues. So I note that Mr. Rutherford, when he attended the hearing, suggested that rezoning to large lot residential 1 was a possibility, as this would allow self-servicing for 3 waters. However, I am of the view that rezoning to large lot residential 1 is not an efficient use of this land and would likely prevent denser zoning in the future once the 3 waters constraints are resolved. And this is something we've already discussed. Ms. Christmas has also mentioned it in her evidence, so I therefore do not recommend rezoning to large lot residential at this time.
That's fine, I understand that. We've been through we've asked you some questions about LLR. My understanding is that it can be envisaged there will be some large lot residential as part of variation 2, but in your report, this particular site will hinder the ability for it to be intensified in the future, different to other blocks, presumably. Is that right?
Primarily, I consider this as broadly suitable for residential rezoning. However, there is uncertainty about the Three Waters upgrades and the time frame for those. So overall, I don't recommend, obviously, rezoning now because of those, and I likewise don't necessarily recommend a RITS as applied, just given that uncertainty.
Thank you.
Next one is the other Soyuz Bay site. This is the one adjacent to the Port Otago warehouse. So there's extensive discussions on reverse sensitivity with Port Otago. And so if I can go to my recommendation, I've made a few response points, but I'll pretty much cover them here. I do consider that a suburban residential environment differs from the commercial and mixed-use environments in terms of expectations, and the solution proposed by Mr. Sycamore is likely to result in effects on amenity value for neighbours, particularly when using outdoor spaces. There are also potential costs associated with monitoring and enforcement, given it is likely that more complaints would be received for this area. The need for a higher noise limit indicates that residential zoning may not be appropriate in this location and may not result in good residential outcomes. I note that on the north and northeast side of the Port Otago facility, there is an existing rural zone buffer between itself and the residential zoning, which is around that 30 to 45 metres away. So based on that, I do note that it is possible that 3 Brick Hill Road is potentially more suitable for residential zoning compared to 18 Noya in respect of reverse sensitivity. But moving on to Three Waters, DC, it's the same issue as the other one. DCC Three Waters continue to advise that residential development is unable to be serviced for wastewater, and there is a long-term time frame to resolve these network issues. There are also constraints with water supply and a medium time frame for those. For these reasons, Three Waters does not support rezoning. Overall, it is my view that residential rezoning is not appropriate, and this is based on both reverse sensitivity issues and the Three Waters constraints, and I do not recommend rezoning RS 171. I note that the submitter has given the idea of a RITS, but it is my view that this does not address the reverse sensitivity issues outlined above, and additionally there remains uncertainty about the timing and nature of the required wastewater upgrades and how to resolve these. For these reasons, I am also opposed to the RITS. And I just reiterate again that I do acknowledge that 3 Brick Hill Road may be more appropriate for residential development given its distance from the Port Otago facility, but my overall view of the site that it is not well suited for residential activity.
Yeah, thank you for that feedback. So just to clarify, for me, the northern part of this doesn't create so much angst for you in terms of reverse sensitivity, but in essence, the Three Waters objection overrides that.
Correct.
Okay.
Did Three Waters specifically address the prospect of half the zoning going ahead, or was it more of a all-embracing comment?
They didn't specifically. However, it's my understanding that they do not support further development in the area, even if it was half the number of sites.
The only other question I had, it possibly was answered in the earlier hearing, was the adjoining land which has been subdivided. That's zone resident, it's township and settlement, I think. So that wouldn't have had any special reverse sensitivity controls brought into play.
I can't comment if it did, because I'm not sure, but I do note it's only the north part of it, so that the bit immediately adjacent to the facility is not residentially zoned.
There are acoustic insulation requirements within a certain distance of an industrial zone. I think 20 metres or 40 from memory. So
that's right, and I remember that now. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. And just to go back to the, I was going to say agreement, may not have been an agreement between the port and the developer. There was certainly an understanding as to what might be acceptable in terms of bespoke rules or the harbour edge zoning type rules. No complaints, noise covenants were part of that suite, weren't they? I think part of it.
So yes.
Yes, and so I guess my question is in relation to the purpose of variation 2, which is as we've been through already, is an easy or early wins variation. would you envisage as a planner that requiring a no complaints covenant fits nicely or not within the ambit of an easy wins solution? Is that something that is sort of going out on a limb a little bit to require that?
I guess my view is if a no complaints covenant is necessary, then I'd question both its practicality or usefulness, and also if it indicates that the site is actually suited for residential zoning, full stop. So you can debate the pros and cons of the no complaints covenant. There are definitely cons. I've mentioned a couple in there, but I think it's a broader indication that perhaps this isn't the best place to look for residential zoning.
That's understood. We'll need to go back and look at that. Thank you. All right, we can go to... Oh, sorry, one.
Just a clarifying question on the Three Waters and wastewater. It appears that basically the Three Waters evidence is that all of Soyuz Bay is actually constrained in its capacity now at this point, and it's a good 20 years potentially before that's going to be upgraded.
Yeah, there was some uncertainty in that time frame because a lot more work is needed, but yes, correct. Yep.
Okay. So again, that's an FDS thing in the future, really, in some respects, in terms of how we'll treat Soyuz Bay with Three Waters, I guess, in the future. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Okay. RS 193. It's Tomahawk 177 Tomahawk Road. This was one that we had second to last day. So firstly, I'd note the submitter's updated structure plan proposal, which now only proposes the top half of the site for residential zoning. They had 3 areas, A, B, C, and then the lower half, which is the bit adjacent to Tomahawk Lagoon. They've named it Area D, and this is proposed for recreation zoning. So in terms of the evidence, or the response to submitter's evidence, DCC Transport has advised there are no overriding transport issues to resolve. Mr McKinlay, in terms of landscape, advises that rezoning Area A, that's the very top bit, Gloucester Street next to Gloucester Street, would have low effects, while Area A and B, sort of the top third-ish, would have at least moderate effects in terms of rural character and visual amenity. Stantec has commented that rezoning is now acceptable from a hazards perspective based on the GeoSolve report that was provided by the submitter. DCC Three Waters continue to not support rezoning. However, it is agreed that the proposed 8 sites in Area A may be possible in terms of Three Waters infrastructure, noting that it still has concerns over the ability to obtain a resource consent for stormwater discharge. Three Waters has recommended that if rezoning does occur, it should be on the condition that the applicant is responsible for obtaining any resource consents associated with stormwater discharge. Stormwater management should be combined with the adjacent 155 Tomahawk, and an NDMA is placed over both 177 Tomahawk and would ideally also include 155 Tomahawk. So based on this Three Waters and landscape evidence, it is my view that rezoning, if it occurs, should be restricted purely to Area A. That's the bit at the very top. I'm hesitant, however, to recommend rezoning in Area A due to the concerns of Three Waters, but note that they do consider it may be possible from an infrastructure perspective. So if rezoning proceeds, I would also of Area A, I would recommend application of an NDMA over the rezoned area. However, I do not consider extending over 155 Tomahawk appropriate or feasible. And also application of a structure plan mapped area to limit the number of dwellings permitted to 8. This is what the submitter was proposing, and it's also what they assessed in their stormwater plan, and include a note in that structure plan that obtaining resource consent for stormwater discharge is the applicant's responsibility, and that any consent granted must be vested in the DCC. So I'm not providing an explicit recommendation to rezone Area A. My recommendation is to, if rezoning does proceed, it should be limited only to Area A.
Just a question of clarification. 155, where's 155 Tomahawk?
So it's, yep.
So that's not even within the scope of the...
Correct.
So it's out of scope?
Correct.
Yep, to do an NDMA there, okay. All right, I'll just hand over to the panel for any questions here. Okay, John.
But 155 has stormwater pipe discharges to it looks like a ground sump that heads out. I mean, so there is stormwater that comes in, presumably somewhere off Tomahawk Road or somewhere like that, that makes its way over in that direction. So how will we deal with stormwater in that regard if it's coming into 155, if it's not under an if the remaining property is not under the same NDMA?
So this possibly also answers the question you had earlier on as well. So while the NDMA is applied just to the site, because that's the area from which development will create additional stormwater, the stormwater management plan that's required to be prepared needs to consider the hydrologic catchment more broadly. So it will consider inflows and areas outside the NDMA in terms of what's coming onto the site, and it will have to manage development, taking that into account and making sure that those maximum flow rates don't change. So it will be considering, it will need to consider those inflows.
And then Three Waters basically did say that it felt there was capacity for potable water and sewage in Area A, right? So it's really, specifically, it's stormwater that we are most focusing on in this regard, right?
Stormwater is probably the make or break, yes.
Yep, good, thanks.
Just in relation to the recreation zone, Area D, is it?
Yeah.
Just occurred to me that might not be within scope either, because Variation 2 doesn't propose to rezone land to recreation, does it?
Yeah.
It's a good question. There is one site that was proposed at the time of notification, so that's specifically within scope of Portobello. That we might come back to you on that one.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to understand the reasons for not supporting rezoning that land to recreation. Can you just summarise what those are? Bearing in mind that it can't be developed essentially if it's recreation zone, can it?
I guess so. I hadn't considered that particular. I guess I'd focused purely on that Area A residential zoning. Residential zoning. I can't, straight off the top of my head, I can't see a drawback to rezoning Area D. I do note that there is no rule that prevents the creation of a road through there, but that's probably actually not relevant if you're not going to do B and C as well.
And Area C has only got one dwelling. Is it Area C's only got one dwelling on it, isn't it? And
correct. Yeah, it's over there.
And so, are the officers really concerned that that one dwelling that's essentially already there, and they're proposing to renovate it and potentially put a new house there? But I'm just thinking the main development node is in Area A, isn't it? And not strongly opposed to that. And B has got fewer houses, hasn't it? So
no, B had a lot. B had about 30-ish houses, high 20s. Yeah. It's Area C. I was going purely and recommending, and it's saying a limit of only Area A. I was based that purely off the Three Waters evidence, which said only Area A could be supported. It's hard to see if one house in Area C could make a difference. But I would have to go back, or we'd have to go back and double check the Three Waters evidence.
It's just a question of clarification on Area D and C, I guess. So, yep. Any further questions?
I'm just following up on Area D, and as Ms. Christmas mentioned, there is the Greenfields zone rezoning in Portobello that has a recreational reserve, which was intended to also potentially play a stormwater management role. And I think Area D here is the top end of it next to Area C was supposed to be where the final retention pond would be formed in their stormwater thing. So I'm just getting to the point where would you think that maybe in this instance the rezoning of one area to recreational is in fact a mechanism by which you can establish stormwater maintenance for the intensified zoning up in Area A? I guess what I'm getting at is, I know that it may be considered, you might have thought it was out of scope, but it's a fact the package is the package, what we're looking at.
But I don't know that a rural zone would preclude having the stormwater ponds there.
Would preclude?
I don't think a rural zone would preclude stormwater management in the area. I don't know that you'd need to rezone it in order to provide for those stormwater ponds.
Right, but they are proposing it more or less as because the intensification in Area A will put demand on the stormwater system. They'll have to put their engineered system somewhere. I got the impression that they were proposing that as a mechanism of effectively achieving two outcomes at the same time. One was develop at ensuring there'd be no development down near the lagoon, and an ability to establish enough space there to deal with stormwater systems that would be required for uphill activity.
What I'm saying, I suppose, is if it remains rural, I don't think that will stop them managing their stormwater in that area.
No. It wouldn't, no.
Yeah.
And just, just finally, the comment from Three Waters that they still have concerns over the ability to obtain a resource consent for discharge. I know they did talk to us about it. I'm just trying to remember what their main reticence or what caused that comment, because we did hear that iwi had been consulted, not necessarily signed off, but they certainly had been consulted. And do you understand, can you remember what their main concerns were about a resource consent being granted? Without us having to go back and look.
This is a significant area of ecological value, and I think they are concerned about the difficulty of obtaining consent from ORC to discharge stormwater into it, despite the fact that Runanga appear to support it. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're okay in terms of questions on that one now. No, understood. Thank you. Move to the next one.
Okay, this is the last site, and then a couple of other points, but we've touched on some of them already. This is Irs 206, Irs 206A, and Irs 77. This is up Northeast Valley. So I've got a number of response points there, particularly relating to Three Waters. There were a number of discussions at the hearing about the proposed Three Waters servicing. Not going to go into them, just to note that they are there. And then a couple of other little points I've also made as well. But if I can go to the recommendation, my recommendation for the site is unchanged from that in the Section 42A report, that is not to rezone. Start with transport. DCC Transport notes that while the information provided by the submitter is helpful, they are currently unable to recommend rezoning the site unless an ITA is provided prior to rezoning in relation to provision of a second access bridge to Area E. Mr McKinlay, in terms of landscape, does not support rezoning Area D given the SNL overlay. He also does not support rezoning in Area E. He acknowledges that rezoning in Area C would likely have less effect on visual amenity and rural character values. And I do also note Mr McKinlay's concerns detailed in his evidence about appropriate access to sunlight for parts of the site in winter. Three Waters has advised it does not support rezoning the site, with more detail provided earlier. Stantec has previously assessed the entire site as having a high hazards level, with the majority of the land having significant areas of possible instability. No expert information was provided by the submitter in relation to hazards. Stantec's assessment was done for the broad site as a whole, and while it noted that some of the site is within typical stability limits, there's a small area in Area D, the, quote, majority of the land has significant areas of possible instability. Despite the submitter's assertion that instability could be dealt with at the time of subdivision, this would be an inconsistent approach compared to other sites with a high-level hazard assessment. Policy 2621D Roman 8 states the potential risk from natural hazards and from the potential effects of climate change on natural hazards is no more than low in the short to long term. In the absence of any further information to the contrary, I consider rezoning would have fundamental conflict with this policy. And finally, I do note that there remains uncertainty about the Indigenous biodiversity values present. While I note the submitter's landscape architect has identified an area of broadleaf trees that should be protected in Area E, and that Area B is now proposed for recreational zoning, another one, I remain concerned that the potential for loss of Indigenous biodiversity in other areas of the site. I also refer to the panel to the evidence of Miss Christmas, which discusses rural zoning and vegetation clearance. So overall, considering the above matters, it is my view that the site is inappropriate for residential zoning, and this applies to both the site as a whole and also the sub-areas of the site. And this is based on the expert evidence received that is not supportive of rezoning.
Thanks for that. And just in relation to that overall recommendation, I was just going to ask whether you've turned your mind to whether there are any areas that that could be acceptable when you consider the expert evidence sort of relates to different parts being either acceptable or not acceptable, but overall you're satisfied from a planning point of view, I guess that there are no parts of that site that are suitable for rezoning. Is that right?
So, I mean, I would highlight even just two pieces of evidence, which would be the Stantec hazards support. It does not high level over the entire site, but if we note a small part in Area D is flatter. However, for example, Mr McKinlay does not support rezoning in Area D given the SNL overlay. So on those alone, that would be a no. But there's also Three Waters has outlined multiple concerns about it. Transport has outlined concerns, and taken as a whole, I do not consider that the site or some parts of it is appropriate.
We understand all those points, so thank you very much. Right, no, that's fine, and I notice you've got some additional comments. We've probably dealt with the...
Yeah, if I can skim through them
one.
very quickly, we've probably dealt with most of them. GF05 was just a change to the recommendation regarding the potential problematic road, so we have discussed that. GF10 was a change to my the recommendation of the structure plan for Honeystone Street to allow a second access point into neighbouring GF11 Walkery.
So just on that, as well as the drafting change, which actually relates to the biodiversity protection and that extra road, as you pointed out, Mr Chair, there'd need to be another clause in there that provides for that connection through the subdivision design that's not sitting in here at the moment.
It's not there at the moment, no. Okay. Is it Roman numeral A, Roman numeral 2? Oh, that's vegetation clearance.
That's to do with the, vegetation clearance. I think it needs a separate clause that says something like subdivision activities must provide for a road in connection to the Helensburgh structure plan mapped area, something like that. We can provide drafting, yeah.
All right, thank you.
And then the last one is an updated recommendation on the DCC submission, which sought to apply a NDMA to any greenfield residential rezoning site added through the resolution of rezoning appeals. So in the Section 42A report, I provided a list of appeal sites I recommended an NDMA be applied to. This list was updated in my opening statement, and I reiterate the 6 there. And in my opening statement, I did note that if the panel accepts the submission, some consequential changes may be required to existing structure plan rules within the 2GP. And my table on that very last page outlines the consequential changes I believe are required.
Yeah. Okay. And can you just summarise Mr. Garbutt's opinion in relation to this? I understood it to be that where you have specified particular sites, then it is within scope to do that, but the ones that are undeterminate or haven't been determined by panel, we don't really have scope to apply NDMA to those sites, but these ones have been identified. Is that right?
My recollection was that you couldn't apply it to future future sites, but you could apply it to ones that have already been through.
Okay. Thank you. Look, that's all the questions we have at the moment. I'm just mindful of the two matters that Ms. Peters sent in, and I think it might be opportune for us to take a short adjournment now, just to see if there's anything we might have missed while we've got you here. If we come back in 10 minutes, if you wish to address those matters, please do so, and we may have any questions that we've missed that we could then ask you. So before we all go away, we'll do that. Just take a short break for 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Okay, that's good. That's all good. Okay, we'll have a look at that as well. But yeah, I think 15 minutes. If you're not able to provide a detailed answer, that's fine. And if you don't wish to answer because you haven't had time, that's fine as well. But it's an opportunity if you wish. Okay, we'll come back at 25 past. Okay. Right. During the court, we had a break, and we don't actually have any. The panel doesn't have any further questions of the officers at this point, other than did you have any response to the matters Ms. Peters sent in?
We've looked through that. We don't have anything specific we'd like to add beyond what we've already said. However, could I possibly do 2 clarifying points for 177 Tomahawk?
Oh yes, sure.
The first was just your the discussion just before regarding the recreation zoning for Area D. We've just had a bit more of a think and a consideration of it, and our view is that rural zoning would actually be better for protection of ecological biodiversity, which is what they're wanting in that area, and that is because recreation zoning is actually quite enabling. It's more appropriate for facilities like sports fields rather than ecological biodiversity protection. So our recommendation would actually be to retain that rural zoning.
I already turned my microphone on before you said okay. And does it change the public access at all? Would recreation zoning be normally open public access, would it not?
Only if the land was vested in DCC, and my recollection of the submitter hadn't intended to vest that land in DCC.
So the zoning does not require vesting in DCC, or
it doesn't require it, no.
Okay.
But it often is, to be honest. Yeah.
And on that same theme, if a structure plan was implemented, could it specify access, public access, or is that something that's beyond what you normally contemplate?
If the requirement was to put in a public road, then that would be public access by default, because the road is access. If the intention is to put in a private driveway, which they could seek if it was only Area A and only a limited number of houses, then I imagine that a structure plan rule could possibly require public access to that area at the bottom. Well, no, it would still be public. It would still be private property. I don't think you could require public access to private property. It would just be in terms of the road. If you wanted it to be public road, I think that's something that could go in a structure plan if you felt that was important.
That's right. Just, and I must stress, we're just teasing out options here. We're not certainly haven't made up our mind on it. But do you have a further point on that? One
more related point just was regarding Area C, which was that area they were proposing only one house for. I just wanted to go back and double check the Three Waters evidence, and I've just confirmed that Three Waters has commented that the stormwater management assessment provided by the submitter was only for Area A and only for those 8 houses. So therefore, regarding Area C, it's unclear if there is adequate stormwater management, and so I would retain my recommendation not to rezone that, just to clarify.
Thanks for clarifying that. All right. And you just didn't wish to make any comment to those other matters that came in. That's fine. On that basis, we're pretty close to concluding the hearing. I just wanted to acknowledge all the good work that's been gone on by all parties to this hearing. We've had a tremendous amount of evidence presented to us, and well thought out evidence as well from submitters, from residents, and from the officers in particular. And we've found the production of the reply report extremely useful. And I just wanted to stress to anyone viewing this that that we take these matters into consideration along with all the other evidence and submissions. They're something that will guide us, but we by no means need to accept all or any of these recommendations. So it's just a process that we've gone through to fully understand where the officers are coming from. We've done the same with the submitters, and the panel will now shortly go into deliberations on these matters. And so the hearing is still open. It's adjourned. We will close it formally at some stage in the future when we're satisfied we do have all the information we need. But in the meantime, I'll just ask Commissioner O'Malley to conclude the hearing with a Maori phrase.
Thank you, Chair. A piti hono tata hono te hanga mate ki te hanga mate, a piti hono tata hono ke hanga ora ki te hanga ora, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
We're now adjourned.